Okay, so I got another good question from a subscriber about sit bone width and the width of the saddle that they should sit on. So given how wide the pelvis is at the bottom where we sit, how does that determine what kind of saddle we get on? So we're going to discuss that right now. So to start, sit bone width and saddle width may correlate slightly. There is some degree of correlation here probably. But as you're going to find out in this video, it's probably not as clear cut as a lot of the saddle manufacturers would have you believe. The first thing to get out of the way is that determining what saddle is best for you is all predicated on, first and foremost, that you have a nearly perfect bike fit position already. Why is this important? Well, the simplest explanation is that if your position isn't set up just about perfect for you, then your position will draw you into a portion of the saddle that you're not meant to sit on, and it doesn't matter if it's the perfect saddle or not. It's not going to feel right. So any bad bike fit will undo all of this. I probably get about 100 bike fits a year where the people coming in are totally convinced they need a new saddle, and after we do the bike fit and adjust things properly, then the current saddle that they're on suddenly feels significantly better. Now sometimes we still go on to change the saddle to something even more comfortable, but they had no idea that how much their fit was affecting their overall comfort on this saddle that really wasn't too bad. And there are a lot of factors to what width the saddle or what type of saddle you should be sitting on. First, we do have sit bone width, that's important, but also your torso angle when you ride. How aggressively you ride will determine what type of saddle you will be sitting on. Also, the dynamic motion of the pelvis, meaning how does the pelvis move over the saddle as you pedal? What direction does it move? Is it a lot of movement? Is it a little movement? Is it equal movement to both sides? And then finally, one other factor that potentially could come into play, of course, is their surrounding soft tissue. Its placement, how much of it there is. So, very thin people might fit a different saddle than heavier people, even if they have structurally very similar skeletons. But the important thing to keep your eye on is that ultimately, at the end of this, the determining factor is just your comfort. And we'll address that more as we go. So again, even though sit bone width does matter, riding posture and soft tissue and mobility of the pelvis, they might matter even more in a lot of circumstances. As you can see from this video, I have 3 different postures that I'm riding at: on the hoods, on the tops of the bars, and then on the drops. And as I move my hand position, my pelvis position moves as well. As you can see how the change in my hand position drives my pelvic position, which then changes the width and the dynamic nature of how I'm moving over the seat with my pelvis. In the past number of years, I have played with a number of times. I've worked on it and then I've given up, and I've worked on it and I've given up. I've worked on trying to classify saddles, come up with a certain number of variables that we could track and measure and classify the saddles in more fine detail. And pretty much I get defeated every time. I keep coming away, scratching my head, trying to, and every time I get a little deeper, I realize there's 2 or 3 more things that I need to keep track of, and that are also extremely difficult to measure in an objective way. And this just comes down to the point that there are so many variables between saddles. You can have saddles that look very roughly in the same shape, and yet they will act very, very differently under a rider. When we're talking about any saddle, we have, again, there are so many variables. We have, yes, there is the width of the saddle, and that's usually the widest portion of the saddle. But then we have a number of widths that matter throughout the rest of the saddle. Its narrowest width, in the middle, or maybe in the back third. And then again, we have to look at how quickly does it taper from its widest point to the middle point. Another factor moving away from just straight width is how much slope is built into the edges of the saddle. How much does it, meaning when you start in the middle and work your way to the side, how quickly does it drop off? Is it abrupt or is it a slow gradual slope. More how much flat sitting surface is there in the back of the saddle. Some saddles have quite a lot, some have almost none. How soft is the cover? How flexible is the shell? How mobile, how flexible are the rails? Which direction will the rails predominantly flex given the stiffness of the shell and the mobility of the rails? Will it flex back? Will it flex forward? Does it move side to side a lot? And then even some of this will depend, again, on the setup of the bike. Where you are clamped on the rails will determine how that saddle will act. And I could literally go through probably another 24 different types of measurements that we could hope to measure and to take and break these down and classify them. But each one of these variables could be, to an individual rider, way more important than the actual width of the saddle. And this might be a good time to spend just a couple of seconds on something. There's a lot of ways people try to classify, manufacturers try and classify their saddles. Like Physique, for instance, they have their saddles classified based on your mobility, how flexible you are and how much you move on the bike. They classify, the real flexible people as modeled as a snake. You have the very inflexible people classified as the bull, and then you have people that are in the middle and they're the chameleon. Well, this is fine, and it roughly matches some characteristics of how people sit on their bikes, in that a more curved saddle is going to be good for someone that has less flexibility, or is a bull, and a more flexible person is might tolerate a flatter saddle profile better. This is fine, but again, there are so many other variables that even this doesn't really scratch the itch entirely, or even that specifically, because, for instance, and this is just personal example, I would be considered in their categorization as a snake, very flexible, I have a lot of pelvic mobility, in a lot of my joints. However, I am actually most comfortable on one of their Aliante saddle series, which is for who they classify as a bull. So it might be an okay starting point, but it's certainly not the final word. So what rules can we apply then? How should we go about finding a saddle? Well, first, I usually recommend people start with a standard shape, something that has a very typical profile, and start there and move. You'll start there, and you might move to more exotic styles, something that has more contour or strange shapes to it as you go. Another example. But I wouldn't necessarily start with some of the different shapes. I would start with something more standard. And number two is, and this is a big one, you want to make sure that you have plenty of flat sitting surface on the saddle. I don't care if the saddle has more contours to it. It needs to have some real estate on it that is flat in the sitting area where you're supposed to be sitting. So even a saddle as curved as this has a lot of contours. There is still a fair bit of flat sitting area back in here. Third, if you think you know how your pelvis moves on the saddle, you're very flexible or you're not very flexible, you could try and constrain yourself to the saddles that are either very flat or very curved. That might get you a half a step closer to the right saddle. I wouldn't bet the bank on it, but it might be a place to start. Again, the biggest thing, make sure the rest of your bike fit is taken care of, and make sure the saddle is adjusted well. And if you can, this is even another big point, going back to what I said previously, is if you can, make sure that the saddle is clamped as close to the center of the rails as you can. That might even mean changing the type of seat post you have from your perfect position with your setback seat post has you clamped all the way forward on the rails. Maybe get a seat post that has a little less setback so you can clamp in the center of the rails and still have the same position relative to the reach of the handlebars. But the last rule is by far the most important. And this is where I caution people often, is the best thing you can do is to just test saddles extensively. Test a lot of them. The worst thing you can do is to read about something online, order something from online without testing it, and then hope it's going to work. I actually encourage people, as much as you can, try and avoid buying anything right away. Borrow. Good bike shops and good fit studios will have saddle libraries. That's what all these saddles are for, where you can test saddles. And not just a parking lot test. You want to be able to borrow it, ride it for a couple of rides at least, to be able to figure out, is this in the ballpark? Is this getting you closer or further away from your goal of being comfortable? So I hope this answered a few questions and maybe gives you a little bit more guidance on how to go forward with finding the right saddle for you. I have a lot more information like this on the website, which you can check out at bikefitadvisor.com. I'll put a link down in the description to that. I also have a members only area that provides a bunch of information for just people that are signed up, and membership is free. Basic membership is free. There'll be here's a link to some of the other, maybe another video that you might find interesting. This one is about actually how to set up these stranger saddles like the ISMs. And if you haven't, please subscribe. It really helps out. And leave any comments below, anything you want answered. This was another video that started off as just a question I received in the comments. So if you have questions, let me know and I will try and get to them. I appreciate it. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.